afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to talk about a Tasmanian woman, Dolly Crooks. Dolly, as she was known, owned this motorbike, a 1908 Sovereign. Dolly and this bike actually have a lot in common. Dolly was born in Launceston and lived there all of her life. And the Sovereign was made in Launceston and spent its first 80 years in that town, moving between 4 different owners who lived within a few kilometres of each other. Dolly didn't do anything extraordinary on this bike. She didn't race it or ride across Australia or set any records in it. But what I hope Dolly did do with this bike was get a good deal of pleasure out of owning and riding it. And she's certainly given the current owner, Greg, a great deal of joy that comes from learning about Dolly and her life. And that's what I'm going to share with you this afternoon, the life of Dolly Crooks. Dorothy May Crooks was born in Launceston in 1897. Her parents were Osborne and Minnie Crooks. Osborne's father had been a publican and Minnie was the daughter of a convict. Dolly had a brother a couple of years older and a sister 7 years younger. Osborne Crooks was described at various times as a plasterer and a dairyman. The Crooks family lived at 100 Talbot Road, on the outskirts of Launceston in northern Tasmania. In 1906, Dolly's father was fined for not sending her and her brother to school for the required number of days. In 1912, Dolly's older brother Alfred was discharged a revolver while playing with a younger boy, John Crave. Now, John was fatally wounded. There was an inquest held and it was determined that the boy's death was accidental. The same year, Alfred was sent to jail for indecent assault on a 9-year-old girl. At the time of his arrest, Alfred was a full-time rabbit trapper, a profession which the judge described as a most demoralising one for a boy. The judge went on to comment that it is a most pitiful thing that 17-year-old Alfred could neither read nor write. Alfred is released from jail the following year in 1913. While serving his sentence, he had learned the trade of a bootmaker. And Dolly is now 16 and is fined for riding her bicycle on the footpath. World War I is declared and neither Dolly's father nor her brother enlist. Now, a description of Alfred from when he was in prison gives us an insight as to why he didn't enlist. Limps on his left foot when walking and wears a built-up boot on his left foot. In 1916, Alfred was charged with causing a disturbance at a meeting regarding the conscription referendum held at the Albert Hall in Launceston. It's 1917 and Dolly is now 20 years old. Alfred marries a 16-year-old Elizabeth Sims, and following the wedding, she moves in with the Crooks family at 100 Talbot Road. In 1919, Dolly becomes an auntie after her brother and sister-in-law have a baby boy. Shortly after, however, her sister-in-law leaves Launceston and returns to her family in Melbourne. Alfred goes after her and convinces her to return. And then they move into a house next door at 102 Talbot Road. 3 years later, in 1922, Dolly's sister-in-law again leaves for Melbourne, and at this time it's permanent. Dolly's younger sister, Hilda, marries, and she moves to number 71 Talbot Road. In 1923, a close neighbour, Evelyn Watchorn, inherits the Sovereign motorcycle following the death of his brother. Alfred was in Melbourne showing poultry at the show and was accused of touching up the birds. In 1924, Dolly's father Osborne was fined £1 after being found guilty of stealing a spirit level. Osborne was only 58 years old at the time, and the report in the Launceston Examiner described him, though, as an elderly man. It went on to report, the case was an unfortunate one, as defendant was not a young man and had lived all of his life in Launceston. He was a married man with a large family to keep. Osborne was represented by Mr. Shields, who asked that the defendant be given the benefit of the First Offenders Act. The defendant had been known personally to him for many years and thought well of him. In 1925, Dolly purchases the Sovereign motorcycle from neighbour Evelyn Watchhorn. It's paid by contra, whereby no money was exchanged, only goods or services. The bike wasn't registered at the time that it was purchased, although it had previously carried registration numbers 11204 and 12962 when under the ownership of the Watchhorn brothers. Now, Dolly never registered the Sovereign in her name or that of any other family member, despite being required to. In 1928, 31-year-old Dolly was listed in the electoral rolls with the occupation home duties. And like the majority of women born around the same time that she was, there's no great paper trail of her life, as she didn't marry or work outside the home. The electoral rolls are really only one of the records that we have of her and where she lived and what she did. Greg, the Sovereign's current owner, originally entertained thoughts that Dolly may have been a nurse returned from the First World War and that she required the use of the Sovereign for her daily work. Greg tells me the Sovereign is not an easy bike to master, and for Dolly to have owned it at all and for so long perhaps tells us a bit about her character. In 1933, 11 years after she had left the Crooks family, Dolly's sister-in-law was granted a divorce on the grounds of cruelty, many details which appeared in the local newspaper. It was reported she'd been locked out of the house, punched in the face, kicked, threatened with a knife, told her son was dead and stopped from taking him with her when she went to Melbourne. She'd been required to work outside the home to earn herself some money, as she was not given any by Alfred. In 1936, Dolly is now 39, and two young men, Ray and Keith Crooks, appear for the first time in electoral rolls, also living at 100 Talbot Road. Ray is probably Dolly's nephew from her brother's broken marriage. Ray marries and moves next door to 102 Talbot Road. Keith never marries and lives most of his life in the same house with Dolly and her parents. Now, when Keith enlists for service in World War II, his papers state that he's been adopted by the Crooks family and that he was born in December 1913. So there is a possibility that he may be Dolly's son. She would have been 17 at the time of his birth. In 1938, 25-year-old Keith Crooks is fined £5 for being a suspected person when he pleaded guilty to being found outside a Launceston jewellery store, drunk, without his shoes, and stuck between the door and a grill with no memory of how he got there. Dolly's father Osborne died in 1939. Now, for many years afterwards, Dolly and her mother placed notices in memory of Osborne in the newspaper. And it was sometime after this, and probably we think during the 1950s, that Dolly parted with the Sovereign. It was sold to the AJS agents in Launceston and then to a Leighton Blaisley, also of Launceston. And it was Leighton who told Greg, the current owner, that he had met Dolly. He confirmed that she definitely rode the bike and that she told him she was always careful when she parked it to position it pointing slightly downwards so that she was able to start it and ride off easily. And he also told Greg, apparently quite unsolicited and out of the blue, that he could tell that Dolly had been quite a looker in her days and that she'd never married, as her sweetheart had gone to the First World War and been killed. So I think that perhaps gives us another little glimpse into the character of Dolly Crooks. In 1965, Dolly's mother, Minnie, died. She was 95. 24 years later, in 1989, Dolly Crooks, the one-time owner of the 1908 Sovereign motorcycle, died only 2 days short of her 90th birthday. And interestingly, she is buried in the family plot in Launceston. Her memorial, as you can see, was placed beside her parents, and it's on the headstone of Keith Crooks, who had predeceased her. In 2018, when the Veteran Car Club conducted a national rally in Deloraine, which is a small town just west of Launceston, the Sovereign motorbike received a lot of publicity from the local newspaper and in particular the local TV station. And as a result, descendants of one of the Sovereign's manufacturers, a Mr. George Gurd, met Greg and were able to see Dolly's bike. And this is a photo of George Gurd and one of his great-grandsons, John Pickerel. And John was one of 3 of George's descendants who came out during the rally to see the bike. And this is Greg, the Sovereign's current owner. And Greg tells me that today when he rides the Sovereign, he says, without fail, I think of Dolly. He now refers to the Sovereign as Dolly, and he says, I do tend to talk with her and encourage her to do her thing. He says, we're now good mates. And I think it looks like Greg also has a great joy in motoring. Thank you very much. This whole talk came about, it was the little slip of paper, the receipt where Dolly bought the bike in 1925, that we're able to get her name from it, the people it came from, and an address, and from all of just that piece of paper, we were able to find out a bit about Dolly. Yes?
A lot of these early motorcycle manufacturers were basically bicycle shop owners.
Yes.
I'm just wondering whether you know much of the context of the manufacture of this bike and
I haven't looked into it too much, but yes, they were. The company was called Wern and Gurd, and they were in Charles Street in Launceston, and yes, they did manufacture bicycles prior to getting into the motorbike business.
And the motor looks almost like it's just like an imported.
The motor on the bike was a Zedel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions?
No, I haven't had a go of the bike. Like I said, Greg said it's really hard to do. He wouldn't have thought, he said he didn't think a woman would own it in the 20s just for fun. He said he really thought, that's why he thought Dolly would have really needed it to do something with, because it's really hard to drive, but a ride. But he said that's why he reckons, and I do too, that perhaps Dolly had so much fun.
Certainly couldn't ride the sides of it. Fiona, for those of you who know, is clutchless. It's a run and jump. So how the heck Dolly ever managed to actually ride it is beyond me.
And Greg had offered, he was going to see if he could bring the bike in to show us today, but he's only just finished organising and running a high-wheeler rally in Maryborough, a national rally, and he said it's in pieces. This was about 2 weeks ago, and he says, well, it's in bits. He said, I'll see what I can do. And a few days ago we thought, look, it's just a bit too onerous, and he said, look, it did save him from pulling an all-nighter, as he said, to put it back together. But he really does enjoy riding. Like he said, he can ride a lot better now. He said he's really mastered it, and he said he just gets so much joy from it, knowing about Dolly, the little that we do know. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thanks, Fiona. Thank you. One from David, yes.
I may have missed it at the start of your talk, but how did you get connected with Greg?
Sorry?
How did you connect up with Greg? How did you find out?
Greg is a member of the Veteran Car Club, as we are, and once he mentioned to me that he had this piece of paper, and he knew that a woman had owned his motorbike. I just kept pestering him until he told me all he did. He could. And then couldn't stop me. So it was that one bit, like I said, that receipt, that one piece of paper, it says on it Ms. Crooks, and it has the name of Evelyn Watchhorn, who she bought the bike off, and the real clue I suppose to find it was Talbot Road. And I just sort of started looking. I've got about 30 years experience with genealogy, so I knew where I was looking and what I was doing. And even though Dolly didn't actually marry or have children within marriage, we were still able to find out a fair bit about her. So Greg is a member of the Veteran Car Club, as are we. Yeah.
You haven't found any descendants of Dolly?
Any what, sorry?
Any descendants of Dolly?
No, well she may have had that child keep. Her sister did have children, so I'm still pursuing the idea that obviously somebody put the plaque on her for when she died in '89. I know her younger sister had children, at least 2 girls. So I think I'm still keen to pursue and try and actually find a picture of her, because I think Greg and I would love to actually see Dolly. And I think even if I did something like put a little ad or something in the Launceston Examiner or through Ancestry, I'll try and get in touch with people. But I'd like to see what she looked like at any point in her life.